I was seated when he said it, back straight, hands folded on the table. The room was cold enough that the glass of water in front of me had started to sweat. "We'll be proceeding without her." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The microphone carried it cleanly across the room. A few heads turned, not all at once. It happened in stages, like a ripple you can see but not stop. The moderator paused, pen hovering above the agenda. Someone in the second row shifted in their chair. I stayed still. My partner smiled as if he were being generous. "This is a founder-only pitch," he continued, glancing briefly in my direction. "And given recent circumstances, it's better if we keep things streamlined." I watched his fingers tap once against the edge of the lectern, a familiar habit. He always did that when he thought he'd won something. The room went quiet. Not awkward quiet, intentional quiet. The kind that follows a decision everyone understands they weren't invited to weigh in on. I didn't respond. The screen behind him still displayed our deck, the logo I'd approved, the metrics I'd verified, the projections I'd corrected 3 nights earlier when the numbers didn't line up. My name wasn't on the slide. It didn't need to be. He'd already taken care of that. One of the investors leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Another checked his phone, thumb flicking once before the screen went dark again. No one objected. This wasn't a democracy. It was a pitch day. My partner cleared his throat. "She's not an employee," he added lightly, as if clarifying a seating chart error. "And frankly, she doesn't have the financial position to participate at this level." There it was, not just exclusion. Reframing, too broke, too small, peripheral. I looked down at the table instead of at him. The surface was polished to a dull shine, reflecting the overhead lights in soft bands. My badge lay face down near my elbow. I didn't move it. The moderator hesitated. "So you're asking that?" "Yes," my partner said smoothly. "I'm asking that she step out. This is my company." That word landed harder than the rest. My company, I felt the heat register. Briefly. It stayed contained, like pressure behind glass. I let it pass. No one asked me anything. That was the point. Decisions like this don't invite conversation. They announce themselves and wait to see who challenges them. I didn't. For a moment, the silence stretched. Long enough that it became noticeable. Long enough that the investor's attention drifted back to me, seated and unmoving, rather than to him, standing and certain. I stood without rushing. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor. I picked up my badge and slipped it into my bag. The zipper closed cleanly. I nodded once toward the moderator. Polite. Neutral. As I walked toward the door, my partner said, "No hard feelings." I paused with my hand on the handle, not to look back, just to let the moment settle. "No," I said calmly. "Of course not." The door closed behind me. The room stayed quiet on the other side. My name is Alina Morales. I was 34 at the time, with a decade of work behind me in operations and early-stage finance, and I'd built my life carefully in the city we were pitching in. I didn't raise my voice in rooms like that. I didn't need to. What he had just done wasn't personal. It was structural. He'd stripped my standing in public, in front of witnesses who mattered, on the assumption that position only counts if it's announced loudly enough. That assumption had been consistent for a long time. I walked down the hallway past framed photos of past cohorts and successful exits. The heels of my shoes clicked evenly against the floor. I didn't slow down. I didn't hurry. Fair contribution deserves fair treatment. When that balance is broken, the correction doesn't come from emotion. It comes from order. I didn't meet him as a visionary. I met him as someone who needed structure. At the time we partnered, I was already established in my work. Operations, early-stage finance, compliance cleanup. The kind of work that doesn't attract attention but keeps companies alive past their first mistakes. I'd spent years learning how systems fail, and more importantly, how they hold when pressure hits. He had ideas, energy, confidence. The kind that fills rooms quickly and empties them just as fast if no one manages the details. Our agreement was clear from the beginning. He would be the face, I would be the spine. I handled incorporation filings, vendor negotiations, financial modeling, investor prep that went beyond the slides, background checks, risk exposure, contingencies. When we missed deadlines, I absorbed the recovery. When conversations went poorly, I recalibrated the approach. I didn't do this quietly because I was afraid to speak. I did it because efficiency matters more than credit when something is being built. There were sacrifices, measurable ones. I deferred contracts to stay available during the raise. I fronted operational costs during a cash-tight quarter. I lent credibility in rooms where his enthusiasm alone wouldn't have carried weight. None of this was framed as charity. It was responsibility. What mattered wasn't that I contributed more. It was that contribution came with an understanding. Participation implied standing. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. First, he spoke over me in meetings. Then he stopped forwarding certain emails. Then decisions were announced after the fact instead of discussed beforehand. Each step small enough to dismiss individually. Together, they formed a pattern. I noticed it early. I didn't confront it immediately, not because I didn't see the imbalance, but because I recognized the shape of it. This was how he operated when he felt momentum. Control tightened. Credit narrowed. Accountability moved outward. I stayed precise. I documented. I made sure every role, every transfer of responsibility, every adjustment had a paper trail. I confirmed terms in writing. I followed up after conversations with summaries that required acknowledgement. This wasn't self-protection out of fear. It was alignment with reality. When someone believes position comes from volume and presence, they tend to overlook the systems that grant legitimacy quietly. They assume those systems exist to serve them, not to measure them. Fair contribution deserves fair treatment. When that equation is ignored long enough, imbalance becomes visible whether anyone wants to name it or not. By the time he decided I was expendable in public, the structure around us already knew otherwise. There's a difference between ambition and entitlement. One builds forward. The other assumes the ground will keep moving on its own. I saw the difference early, but I didn't label it yet. I just adjusted around it. When deadlines slipped, I recalculated timelines instead of arguing. When commitments were overstated, I clarified them quietly with the people who would actually be affected. I tracked decisions in shared documents. I saved versions. I kept calendars clean and verifiable, not out of suspicion, out of habit. He preferred verbal momentum, big statements, forward motion without friction. I preferred confirmation. If something mattered, it deserved a record. Over time, the pattern sharpened. He took meetings without looping me in, then asked me to clean things up afterward. He accepted introductions that implied authority he hadn't earned yet. When questions came back, financial, operational, legal, he redirected them to me, usually with a smile and a line about how I was great with details. That was the point. What changed wasn't the work. It was how he talked about it when I wasn't in the room. I noticed it in the follow-up emails that no longer included my name. In the revised decks where my annotations had been accepted, but my attribution removed. In the way conversations paused when I entered late, then resumed at a slightly different angle. None of it was dramatic. That's why it worked. I didn't confront him after the first instance, or the second. Confrontation would have framed it as emotional disagreement instead of structural drift. I wasn't interested in arguments. I was interested in alignment, so I leaned into process. I confirmed roles in writing after strategy sessions. I asked for clarity on authority boundaries during planning calls. I requested copies of executed agreements instead of summaries. When money moved, I made sure the movement was logged, dated, and categorized. There were moments when he bristled. He'd joke about me being overly cautious. He'd say things like, "You worry too much about what could go wrong." I didn't respond to that. I just kept working. One afternoon, I sat alone in a conference room reviewing a revised cap table he'd circulated. The room was empty. The screen hummed softly. I noticed a discrepancy in the way advisory equity had been labeled. Small but consequential. I corrected it and sent it back with a note asking for confirmation. He didn't reply for 2 days. When he finally did, it was a thumbs-up emoji and a forwarded message to an investor, already reframing the change as his initiative. That was the moment the pattern stopped being ambiguous. From then on, I treated every interaction as something that might need to stand on its own later. Not defensively, deliberately. I kept copies of signed documents in 2 places. I logged approvals with timestamps. I asked third parties to confirm instructions directly instead of through him. If there was ambiguity, I resolved it before it could become narrative. This wasn't preparation for conflict. It was preparation for reality. People who rely on dominance tend to underestimate consistency. They mistake silence for agreement. They assume restraint means disengagement. It doesn't. It means positioning. By the time he felt confident enough to sideline me publicly, he had already revealed how he understood fairness. Not as balance, but as advantage. Restraint is not weakness when it protects structure. The leverage didn't begin as leverage. It began as caution. Early on, when the company was still an idea and not yet a story anyone else wanted to tell, we needed flexibility. Capital without noise. Authority without spectacle. The kind of structure that could absorb mistakes without advertising them. That was my recommendation. I proposed a layered arrangement. Not unusual. Not aggressive. A framework that allowed funding to move in stages, tied to governance milestones rather than enthusiasm. It protected everyone involved, including him, though he never described it that way. He didn't read the full drafts. He skimmed summaries. He trusted me to handle the language, so I did. The documents established operational control separately from public representation. They defined participation thresholds. They accounted for scenarios where decision-making authority needed to shift without disrupting the company's outward continuity. None of it was secret. It was filed, reviewed, acknowledged. He signed where he was told to sign. At the time, he laughed about it, said things like, "This is why I have you," as if structure were a personality trait instead of a necessity. I didn't correct him. Part of the arrangement included a silent position. No title, no announcement, no slide deck mention. Just a mechanism that allowed capital to be introduced, converted, or withheld based on compliance with predefined conditions. It wasn't designed for punishment. It was designed for stability. I confirmed the terms with counsel. Twice. I asked questions that weren't flattering. What happens if roles blur? What happens if representation diverges from reality? What happens if someone claims authority they haven't earned? The answers were clear. The system didn't care about tone or intention. It responded to facts. I filed the confirmations. I kept copies. Over the next year, we used the structure exactly as intended. Funds moved incrementally. Approvals were logged. Oversight remained quiet. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it was measured. He liked that. He liked being able to move fast without worrying about the ground beneath him. What he didn't like was friction. Any reminder that visibility and control weren't the same thing irritated him. When I asked for confirmations, he waved them off. When I mentioned compliance thresholds, he joked about lawyers slowing everything down. Still, he didn't revoke anything. He didn't amend the agreements. He didn't ask for changes. People who feel secure rarely revisit foundations. As the pitch approached, I reviewed the documents again. Slowly, line by line. Not because I expected conflict, but because timing has consequences. Certain provisions activate based on behavior, not argument. Representation matters. Exclusion matters. Public claims matter. I noted dates. I checked filings. I confirmed standing with third parties who had no emotional stake in the outcome. There was no rush. Systems like this don't reward urgency. They reward accuracy. By the time he decided to redefine me as peripheral in a room full of witnesses, the framework didn't need interpretation. It needed acknowledgement. I didn't adjust anything after the fact. I didn't add clauses. I didn't initiate enforcement. I let the system observe. That's the mistake people like him make. They believe leverage is something you brandish. Something loud. Something reactive. They don't realize the most effective systems are already watching long before anyone raises their voice. Systems exist to enforce agreements, not emotions. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for 10 days later. Same building, different floor. This room was smaller. No stage, no microphones, just a long table, glass walls, and a view of the city that made people sit a little straighter than usual. Authority didn't announce itself here. It assumed compliance. I arrived early and took the seat closest to the window, not at the head, not at the end, somewhere neutral. My bag rested against the chair leg. Inside it, a single folder lay flat, its edges aligned. He came in talking. Laughing, actually. Too loud for the space. He shook hands with people whose names he'd practiced. He moved as if momentum alone would carry him through whatever came next. He barely looked at me. "Didn't expect you here," he said, not unkindly. Amused. "I was asked to attend," I replied. My voice was even. 2 sentences would have been unnecessary. One of the advisors cleared her throat and gestured for everyone to sit. The door closed. The sound was soft but final. Papers were distributed, not by me. The legal counsel spoke first, outlining the agenda in clipped, careful language. Governance review, capital position, authority confirmation, routine on paper. My partner leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, relaxed. He glanced at his phone once before placing it face down on the table, a small concession to formality. I watched the condensation slide down my water glass and collect at the base. No one spoke for a moment. Silence settled into the room like a held breath. The counsel opened the folder in front of her. "Before we proceed," she said, "we need to clarify standing." He smiled. "Of course." She read aloud from the document, titles, roles. Conditions. Her voice didn't change as she moved through the language. It didn't need to. Halfway through, my partner frowned, just slightly. "That's not," he began. She held up a finger, polite, firm. "Let me finish." The room went quiet again, not tense, focused. I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze on the table, on the edge of the folder as it was slid toward me and then past me, stopping in front of the independent advisor. Dates were confirmed, signatures acknowledged, compliance thresholds referenced. Each point landed without commentary. When she reached the clause that mattered, she paused. There was a beat of silence, intentional. She looked up. "This provision activates under specific conditions," she said. "Those conditions have been met." My partner laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "That's not possible." No one responded immediately. The advisor adjusted her glasses and reviewed the page again. "It is," she said simply. He turned toward me then, fully. His expression shifted, confidence giving way to irritation. "You didn't mention this," he said. I waited a moment before answering, long enough for the room to feel it. "It was always there," I said. "Nothing new was added." I closed my mouth. That was all. The counsel continued, explaining process, next steps, confirmations required. She spoke as if the outcome were already settled because it was. My partner's foot tapped under the table. Once, then faster. The room stayed calm. The city outside kept moving. The system did what it had been designed to do. Truth does not require volume. He pushed his chair back slightly, just enough to signal resistance without committing to it. "This is being misinterpreted," he said, looking around the table instead of at the documents. "We can clear this up." No one answered him right away. The counsel reviewed the page again, slower this time, as if repetition might make the reality easier to accept. The independent advisor leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes steady. "There's no ambiguity here," she said. "The conditions are explicit." He shook his head. "You're talking about technicalities." Silence followed, not dismissal, correction. "These are governance triggers," the counsel replied. "They're not technicalities. They're safeguards." He turned to me again, his voice lowered. "You knew this would happen." I didn't respond. The advisor spoke instead. "The structure was established before any dispute existed. That matters." His jaw tightened. "So what, this just happens now?" The counsel nodded. "Process doesn't wait for comfort." For the first time, he leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "I built this company." The words came out sharp, almost pleading, though he hadn't realized it yet. The advisor didn't flinch. "You represented it," she said. "That's not the same thing." I watched his face change, color rising, breathing shallow. He glanced at the door as if expecting someone to intervene. No one did. He tried again. "This can't be enforced without my consent." The counsel slid another page forward, paper on glass, a soft sound. "It already has been," she said. He stared at the page, then at me. "You did this," he said, louder now. I lifted my eyes to meet his, briefly. I followed the agreement, I said. Nothing more. He laughed, short and brittle. This is unbelievable. The advisor waited until the sound stopped. What's unbelievable, she said, is how often people forget what they signed. He stood then, abruptly. The chair legs scraped against the floor. The room stayed seated. This is insane, he said. I'll contest it. The counsel nodded. You're entitled to pursue review. There it was, the last illusion of control. She continued evenly, but enforcement does not pause during review. His mouth opened, closed. He looked around again, searching for alignment for sympathy. He didn't find it. The advisor gathered her papers. We'll proceed with the next steps as outlined, she said. You'll be notified in writing. He sat back down slowly, as if gravity had increased. No one spoke for a moment. I focused on the edge of the table, on a small chip in the glass near my thumb. I hadn't noticed it before. It caught the light at a sharp angle. The counsel closed her folder. That concludes the confirmation. My partner exhaled hard through his nose. The sound lingered in the quiet room longer than it should have. Consequences follow structure, not sentiment. I wasn't present for what followed. That was deliberate. Weeks later, I was informed that he had requested an internal review. It was acknowledged, logged, declined. The response cited procedural compliance and reaffirmed the original findings. No commentary, no invitation to debate. By the end of the first month, the operational accounts had been frozen pending restructuring. Notifications went out to vendors and partners. Access permissions were revised. Titles were adjusted to reflect authority that could be verified, not claimed. I learned about this the same way everyone else did, through formal notices, through third parties who had no reason to soften the language. He retained counsel, filed objections, requested meetings that were scheduled, postponed, and then canceled. Each attempt followed the same arc: acknowledgement, review, refusal. Process is patient. 3 months in, a revised leadership disclosure was circulated. It removed his name from positions that required fiduciary standing. There was no announcement, just an update in the system. Investors adjusted accordingly. Some withdrew quietly. Others stayed, but only after conditions were renegotiated. Momentum slowed, not catastrophically, precisely. By the end of the quarter, the office space was downsized. The open plan area he'd insisted on was replaced with a smaller footprint and fewer access points. Staff numbers contracted. Consultants weren't renewed. I wasn't there to see it. What reached me came through neutral channels. A forwarded notice, a calendar cancellation, a brief mention during a call unrelated to him. At one point, an industry bulletin summarized the situation in a single paragraph. No names emphasized, no speculation. Just a description of restructuring following governance review. That was enough. Socially, the shift was quieter. Invitations stopped. Introductions dried up. People who had once laughed at his stories began to avoid mentioning him at all. Not out of judgment, out of distance. The system didn't isolate him, it reclassified him. I continued my work elsewhere. Contracts honored. Reputation intact. No explanations offered because none were requested. Accountability continues even when no one is watching. By the time the year ended, his presence in the space we'd shared had narrowed to a line item, then to a footnote, then to nothing at all. Order doesn't announce itself when it's restored. It simply resumes. I didn't attend the final closing meeting. There was no reason to. By then, the structure had settled into its new shape. Oversight reassigned. Reporting lines clarified. Capital positioned where it could be managed without volatility. The work continued, quieter and cleaner than before. I kept my distance, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. There's a difference between stepping away and being removed. I chose the first. I declined invitations that no longer required my presence. I transferred what needed to be transferred. I signed what required my signature and left the rest untouched. No speeches, no explanations. A few months later, I redirected a portion of my returns into a small fund that supports early-stage operators who work behind the scenes. Not founders, builders, the ones who understand that stability is an achievement, not an afterthought. I didn't put my name on it. The structure mattered more than recognition. Occasionally, someone would mention him in passing, usually in the past tense. I never corrected them. The city moved on. Markets always do. When I thought back to that first room, the stage, the microphone, the way he'd said my exclusion out loud, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. The kind that comes when something no longer has access to you. Satisfaction registered once. Briefly, it passed. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about alignment being restored where it had been deliberately broken. About agreements functioning as intended when tested publicly. Justice doesn't need to announce itself to be complete. I still sit the same way in rooms like that. Back straight, hands steady, observing more than I speak. Some habits don't change because they were never reactions to begin with. The matter was finished, and it stayed that way.